Hello, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Fostering Process of Reconciliation. My name is Carissa Rana. I'm with OJADP's National Training Technical Assistance Center, and I would like to take a couple of minutes to discuss a few features of the Adobe Connect webinar platform. For those wishing to download a copy of the PowerPoint slides and other important documents, you may do so by locating the handout pod directly above the chat area. Click on the name of the file, and then click the download button. At the end of today's webinar, there will be a Q&A session where presenters will address some of the questions posed during the presentation. Please type your questions into the chat box as they arise. For those of you participating in today's webinar as a group, please take a minute and help us count. Go to the chat window and type in the total number of additional people in the room with you today. If you are viewing alone, there is no need to type anything into that chat pod at this time. At the conclusion of today's webinar, you will be provided with a link to take a brief survey about today's presentation. You'll be able to access the link to the evaluation on the last slide of the PowerPoint. We appreciate your feedback regarding this webinar. Finally, this event will be archived in approximately 3 weeks in OJADP's online university at www.ojdpou.org, where you can also check out past webinars. Again, thank you for joining us today. I will now turn it over to Nena Onyema from John Jay's Community College to begin today's webinar.
Thank you, Clarissa, and hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining the National Initiative for Building Community Trust and Justice today for the first of our series of webinars titled Fostering Processes of Reconciliation. The Department of Justice awarded the National Network for Safe Communities through the John Jay College of Criminal Justice a 3-year grant to launch the National Initiative for Building Community Trust and Justice in the September of 2014. This initiative aims to improve relationships and increase trust between communities, more specifically marginalized communities, and the criminal justice system. One way that we hope to do this is through a 3-pillar approach that includes procedural justice, implicit bias, and today's topic of discussion, reconciliation. This webinar will be led by David Kennedy, Director of the National Network for Safe Communities. Central to Mr. Kennedy's extensive fieldwork has been a process of reconciliation that he designed by engaging communities historically divided from law enforcement, dispelling toxic misunderstandings between them, fostering a process of truth-telling that allows them to find common ground and address serious violence in partnership, and allowing law enforcement to step back and communities to reset their own public safety standards. We're excited to share our work and thinking around reconciliation. And at this time, it is my pleasure to introduce Mr. David Kennedy.
Thanks, Nena, and good afternoon, everybody. We've been looking forward both to this event and to being actually in a position to talk about the sort of work that we're going to be addressing here for a long, long time. So, welcome. So, Nena has just introduced the National Initiative. National Initiative is a co-project between the Department of Justice and 4 outside partners. There's my shop, the National Network for Safe Communities at John Jay. There's the Justice Collaboratory at Yale, which is principally Professors Tracy Mears and Tom Tyler. There's the Center for Policing Equity at UCLA, which is most principally Professor Philip Atiba Goff. And there's the Justice Policy Center at the Urban Institute, particularly its head, Nancy Levine. So we're doing this work together. There are these 3 core substantive areas within the National Initiative. We are working on procedural justice, which is fundamentally about the experience on the part of the public with being policed. So it is about the nature of those interactions. We know that procedural justice is linked to legitimacy, and we know that particularly in the most troubled neighborhoods, as public feelings of legitimacy toward the police go up, crime goes down, and we know that as legitimacy goes down, crime goes up. So we want both of those things moving in the right direction. That's principally the Yale team's area. We are working on implicit bias, which is the psychological fact of the way the human brain makes connections and deploys those connections in practice, which means that those essentially automatic responses govern our choices and our behavior, and in particular circumstances can produce outcomes that are, for example, greatly racially disproportionate without representing any actual characterological racism on the part of the people making those choices and decisions. That's principally Phil Goff's team at UCLA. And there's my particular area, which is reconciliation, which is about the deeply grooved and very complicated relationships and sometimes lack of relationships between certain communities and law enforcement, particularly the police. And what we know about all these areas, we certainly think they all matter. We know that there is both a lot of science and a lot of field experience with deploying the theory and practice of both procedural justice and implicit bias in the field, and within that, within policing and other elements of law enforcement. That has not been true of reconciliation. There is next to no record of active work in the United States deliberately framed around reconciliation thinking and processes between the police and disenfranchised, angry communities. When we get to the end of this, there's a citation to a paper of my own on drug market work, which had reconciliation ideas built into it and which looked very, very promising on a small scale. You know, drug markets are less than neighborhood size most of the time. The national initiative has aspired to bring that reconciliation thinking and practice to a city scale, and you're about to get the benefit of that thinking. The national initiative is working in principally on the ground the pilot sites of Stockton, Pittsburgh, Minneapolis, Gary, Fort Worth, and Birmingham. The kind of first among equals focus and most of the focus of this conversation about reconciliation has to do with African American neighborhoods, but we are explicitly looking at a number of other populations and hope to bring the reconciliation work into those orbits. And within the national initiative, there is an action research component driving change on the ground and assessing that, we hope, change. There is a research component focused on pre-post evaluation and other important issues, and there is a public conversation clearinghouse component. So, reconciliation. We think that it is true that in some hypothetical environment, police could change a great deal about what they are doing going forward, and that no matter how positive that might be in practice, that will not get by itself. It's essential but not entirely sufficient to get to the complicated facts of the way communities look at police and the way police look at communities. For the core, simple but core fact that those sorts of changes go forward, whereas experiences, history, relationships, understanding of actions, stories, narratives, all those sorts of things are built on historical experience, sometimes long, deep history, sometimes very recent history. But those relationships and those understandings need independent attention. and that if we are successful, we will not fix everything. Right? There's no way to go back in time and correct what has been done. But what we want is enough understanding and enough trust between police and communities that currently lack that they have sufficiently strong relationships and understandings that they can work together going forward. And as I've thought about this in sometimes very simple terms, personally, I had shoulder surgery not so long ago that I can't remember how devastating it was. And as I sat awake the night before I was going to do that, I did not have to like my surgeon, but I absolutely had to trust him. And as we all know, we are in a crisis of trust around policing in the country, and this explicit reconciliation work is an attempt to come at that directly and to make, we are genuinely optimistic, really meaningful headway on that. Probably none of us on this call need to have it pointed out to us that we've got a problem here, but empirically we have a problem. There is a high level and a higher level than in other communities of confidence between especially African American communities and the police, right? So the last bar presented here is now nearly 2 years old, and given what's going on in the country, this will almost certainly look worse now than it does here. But more than half of Black Americans expressed either very little or a small amount of confidence in the fundamental equity of policing, right? That's a problem. If one works in these neighborhoods in any way, lives in them, works in them, listens to them, there is a significant portion. So no community is monolithic, and these views do not express or are not expressed by everybody in these places. But large and sometimes dominant parts of these communities genuinely believe that law enforcement is doing them deliberate harm under color of law. And again, everybody who has worked in these places has heard these points of view, whether they take them seriously or not. They are not hidden. They are very, very, very clear. And one of the several books I try to get everybody to read these days is Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, which is a brilliantly done book-length exposition of the fundamental idea that the law, and particularly policing, is a deliberate product of conspiracy by the power structure to do damage to Black Americans through the criminal justice system. Rod Brunson is a brilliant ethnographer. He's a professor at Rutgers. He does ethnographic work in these communities. He wrote an article that was published in Criminology and Public Policy some years back. I use it as a crystalline example of this. This is a direct quote from Rod's article, given him by a young Black man in St. Louis, and his very clear understanding of his experience with being policed is the police don't like Black people. Rod actually used it as the title of his article. And I spent a lot of time talking about this with folks, including police officers, who are utterly outraged by these points of view, and I fully understand that outrage. And what I've learned over the years, and what I think we all need to recognize, and what I try to explain to them, is you can be legitimately convinced that Lamont and people like him are absolutely factually incorrect. but the fact that he and many, many, many other people in his community believe this means that there's something that we need to take very seriously. And there's almost a perfect mirror image on the other side, which again is by no means everybody in policing or everybody in law enforcement, but you find a significant number of officers and those acting in other parts of criminal justice who have more or less completely written these communities off. They look at what they see as high levels of crime, as silence about that crime, as very high levels of recidivism, all that sort of thing. And they fundamentally simply believe that these are lost communities. Peter Moskos is a colleague here at John Jay. He did as his doctoral research. He actually went through the police academy and was on the job in Baltimore. This is a direct quote from one of his peers in the Eastern District of Baltimore. And what Peter does not say in his book, but which turns out to be true, is that the person saying this was not just a police officer, he was a field training officer who taught other police officers how to do their job. And again, far from everybody on the job believes this, but enough do that if you talk to people in these communities, they know this, and they know that people feel like this about them. So this is really a problem. As long as any kind of significant part of either communities or police feel like this about each other, we are in real trouble. We think that both sides need to do work. We see that in practice, almost always the police need to go first. They have to open the door. But we also see that when they do, that door is open for conversation about and movement on the community side as well. We are really optimistic about this. We spend a lot of time with folks in both policing and in communities, and particularly among leadership on both sides. There's a real recognition that things need to change. And I'll give you some examples of this in a minute, but the place that police leadership has gotten to in the last couple of years on this is pretty remarkable. And over decades of doing this, we have never found a community that, no matter how angry it is, when approached in the right way, refuses to come to the table and talk about what might be true going forward. This work and this conversation are nested within the national initiative. Just to go back, all the departments that are part of the national initiative have begun by saying, we know we need to do work on procedural justice. We know we need to do work on implicit bias. They are there already, which I really believe all by itself is, again, pretty remarkable. And given what we feel like in many ways is a pretty optimistic starting point, the National Initiative has given us the opportunity to spend the last year or so mapping out what we believe now are the central building blocks of a citywide reconciliation process. And it begins with saying that there needs to be real acknowledgement of things that we all ought to recognize have been and are wrong. That begins with real American history. Right? We need to recognize what is simply historically true, which is that up until the civil rights reforms of the 1960s, the law and the agencies of the law, including police, were in fact part of a explicitly legally racist structure of law and law enforcement in the United States that goes through literally before the founding of the nation, through transportation, through the 19th century, most, in fact, of the 20th century up until the early 1960s. And we're finding remarkable willingness by police leadership to simply say all of the things that you see in front of you. That while they have love and confidence in their agencies, they are not perfect. There is racism, there is bias. The police have played a role in feeding people into a system that has produced mass incarceration. They have a small number of very bad actors who do a lot of damage, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that they enter into this process having made their own way to believing that policing needs to change in some very particular ways, and that they are not in fact being forced or coerced into it. It's what they think themselves. And we find extraordinarily, I think, brave statements being made by very prominent figures in policing. This is probably the most prominent figure in American policing, Bill Bratton, now in New York City. And the fact that people like him are saying things like this now is something that I don't think any of us would have imagined even a few years ago. But they are plugged into the life of their cities, they are plugged into the life of their professions, they're plugged into the national conversations. And people like Bill are now saying things like this. And they're saying it publicly, they're doing work with their own people to help bring them along to understand this themselves. And again, because we are blessed with being able to spend a lot of time in these circles, we know through direct experience that they are far, far ahead of where most people in the country who care about this sort of thing would really credit, which again is a very, very strong place from which to begin. I love this story. This is Chief Kevin Murphy in Montgomery, Alabama a few years ago. Those of you who know your civil rights history will know that one of the signal events in American civil rights was the attack on marchers to Selma who came into the Montgomery bus station in 1961, and in what was a deliberate, planned attack, were viciously beaten by a crowd that included law enforcement folks. One of those attacked that day was Martin Luther King's key associate, now longtime Congressman John Lewis, probably the most prominent surviving member of that civil rights circle. And about 3 years ago, Lewis went back to the scene of the attack for an observation of that moment. Kevin Murphy, who then ran the Montgomery Police Department, didn't ask anybody, didn't tell anybody he was going to do this, but with the cameras rolling, went in public to Lewis, took his badge off and gave it to him and said what you see in front of you. You were right, we were wrong, you were representing core American values, we should have protected you, we didn't do it, and I apologize. And the story is actually really kind of heartwarming and heartbreaking. Lewis said to Murphy, I don't deserve your badge, you keep it. And Murphy said, that's all right, I've got another one at home, you take this one. And Lewis cried. He displayed the badge on the floor of the House of Representatives. He and Murphy went on the road together. Lewis called Murphy his brother and said over and over and over again, in all the time since that happened, nobody ever said it was wrong. Nobody ever apologized for it. And that's what we needed to hear. And anybody who does restorative justice or victims work or anything like that will say that what people want more than anything else is an acknowledgement of what happened and that it was not okay. And we find really, really prominent and, again, I think courageous police leadership more than willing to do that. What one hears from the public over and over and over again is people don't take us seriously, we are not respected, people don't listen to us. And so rather than going directly to policies and practice and steps that the PD will take and action changes and all that kind of thing, what we often leave out is paying attention and listening. So we think that there should be secure ways in which communities can speak to the police, both leadership and rank and file, and in which police can in turn be heard by members of the public. And there are existing approaches to creating and facilitating those safe spaces. We believe that police should enter into this process by saying to the public, we believe there needs to be change. And we're just looking at the anniversary of the release of the President's 21st Century Commission report. Departments all over the country are following this and referencing it. It begins by saying things need to change. And we see, again, not just the better, but most departments taking that on and taking it as a starting point. They want to have better relationships with their public. They think, as they've been saying forever, we can't arrest our way out of this. They want to act in different ways. They are increasingly coming to understand that there are a few high-risk people out there and not bad communities full of bad people. They recognize the lasting consequences of arrest and incarceration, and they need to articulate to communities that they're there already and they get that. A lot of this is really about the historical experience and the historical narratives of the community's experience of being policed. So we think that there should be a process in which that is documented and made clearly available in what one hopes will be, in the end, a crisp, direct consensus form. So Birmingham, Alabama is one of the national initiative sites. And the chief in Birmingham has a phrase he uses all the time because Birmingham was a central civil rights site. He calls it policing under the burden of history. And the history of the civil rights movement is live and present in community narratives in Birmingham right now. And the department has its own internal history course that it uses to bring recruits and rank and file up to date. It has relationships with historical museums in Birmingham. They embrace this and make sure that their own people understand how the community has come to feel the way it does. And we want to have these basic facts laid out in a way that both sides can agree represents a real record, a real set of agreed upon facts about what's going on. And in most of this, as I said, the police need to go first, and a lot of this is about the actions and the history and the perceptions of policing and law enforcement. But it's not all about that, and there are community issues that need to be addressed as well. And if you talk to police officers, the one they always begin with is protecting the violent, right? So there needs to be a shared understanding of these facts. People need a chance to tell their stories. So facts are one thing and agreed upon reality is another. Stories and perceptions are yet another. So residents will talk about the police officer who stood over their brother's body at a homicide scene laughing with his fellow officers, which is a shock and trauma response, and first responders understand that, but he will say, that's the day I came to understand that the police don't care about, me and mine. And that officer will talk about being at that same scene and knowing that people knew who pulled that trigger, and that day and in the years since, nobody said anything, and that's why he decided the community didn't care about violence. And both of those conclusions may be wrong, but the reason people come to their understandings are perfectly understandable, and we think that there needs to be, again, a safe way in which people can share those experiences. There should be very specific ways in which all this process, which is fundamentally about mutual understanding and relationship building, doesn't stop there, but goes to real changes in actual behavior on the part of both law enforcement and communities. There are a lot of these on which to draw. The National Initiative is producing a compendium of things that jurisdictions are actually doing nationally right now. And a lot of them are very interesting, and they are, in fact, the sorts of things that communities are saying they want. Ways in which fewer people can be arrested, fewer people can go to jail, people can get more help rather than just punishment, ways in which to deal with the carryover of previous practice, including bad practice, ways to reduce the collateral consequences of current practice. This is just a few of these sorts of things. There are scores and scores and scores of things that agencies and communities can look at together and start to think about. They will, of course, think of their own themselves. And what we find in practice is that when law enforcement begins this, goes to communities and says, we get it, we know there are issues, we are affirmatively going to say some of the things that have happened in the past are not just unacceptable, some of them we find actively abhorrent. We're not going to do what people like us have done for a long time, which is to say we weren't there, we didn't do it, let's move on. It was real, this agency, this institution did those things, we are going to acknowledge it, we are going to say affirmatively how much we reject that. There are things we've done since that, while well-intentioned, did not work and sometimes caused unintended consequences in your community. We have come to recognize that we want to use as little law enforcement as possible rather than, as we have sometimes tried, as much. We want a more respectful relationship. We want to make change. That when, as I keep saying, when the police go first with that sort of thing, communities are willing also to step forward and talk about work that needs to be done on their side. So we just got a story today from one of our field partners about a picnic in which the community had made a piñata of a pig dressed as a police officer. And we're having the kids play the piñata game by hitting this pig cop with sticks. And they would like to be able to go to the community and say, we understand why you feel about this, but also understand that if this is what you're teaching your kids to think, then when we need to work with them to protect you and them in 5 and 10 and 15 years, they are going to hate us, and we would rather you not teach them that. So what we see is when law enforcement goes first, those conversations become possible, and this is my own language, and I won't implicate either of my partners or the Justice Department in this, but what I see over and over and over again is that for a long time, both sides have been defining the other by the very worst things that anybody does. And it's time we stop doing that. Understanding each other better and having better relationships would be a good thing, but it's not enough. So we think all of this should lead up to a concrete mechanism, some sort of body that will take advantage of these new relationships and understandings and actually take on the work of changing policy and practice. And that when you put all of this together, you get a pretty simple map of what this sort of thing might look like. So we are about to begin these small group consultations between executives and community leadership in the national initiative sites. In those meetings, we expect that the national initiative chiefs will begin by saying, I want to say that there have been historical and more recent harms. I acknowledge those. I abhor them. I want to change them. There are a few things that I have in mind that I can actually do right now, and if you approve of those, I will do them unilaterally. But I need to listen to you. I want to hear your experience of being policed. I want to know what you think we should do. And until you've spoken your piece, we're not going to go on any further with, strategic planning and all that kind of thing. We want to replicate that process between larger numbers of the community and larger numbers of working police officers. We think that in those conversations there will be perspectives and stories and anecdotes and signal moments that will jump out and that can be turned into various kinds of art forms. They can go into a record. They can go into a fact-finding document. They can be turned into YouTube spots. They can be turned into podcasts. They can be deliberately promulgated within the department and outside in the community in ways that even larger numbers of people can be privy to and even participate in this process. And our very strong hope is that over that process and out of that process, that set of new understandings and relationships and aspirations can be fed into some sort of local institution comprised probably of law enforcement, community folks, city figures, maybe foundations and others, possibly even the odd academic or two, but that can be a kind of center of gravity for driving actual change in action. And as I noted, the cities are there already. They're have begun with work on procedural justice and implicit bias. There's a very large range of national practices from which to consider and borrow. Any city that does this will have its own ideas. They've got them already. They will have further ones. And that out of those action possibilities, and again, the sort of changed aspirations and relationships, that can and should and will drive actual changes in what people do in the city, which is, of course, what we all want. So the National Initiative designed this process, what we call the essential process, with the idea that any city that committed to it would have the resources to put this sort of thing together. We have also designed something that would be much more institutionalized and robust than that. And as we did this work, we took guidance from folks who actually designed the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and process in South Africa, have done that same work in post-conflict situations in the Balkans and Central and Latin America, who have done this sort of work in Mississippi. And it's also, at this point, sort of built on all of this theorizing and guidance to think of something that would be higher profile, genuinely institutionalized, would have real guidance and blue ribbon panels and be able to take hearings and employ proper researchers to do the historical work, real communications specialists to create the art forms and the communications campaign and all that sort of thing. And this would require municipal funding or foundation funding or something like that. And we will be actively looking for a jurisdiction that wants to step up and do this kind of work. But the outline's the same. And the goal is the same, which is that in a very simple, common sense way, people will distrust each other less, trust each other more, have a common ground on which to build going forward, and can actually work together to change both practice and relationships in ways that both would find far less damaging and we think honestly much more congenial and much more productive. So that's me. I will say for the record, I do not have a PhD. I've been promoted here, which I appreciate. And this talk today was designed as, at best, a setting of the table. The Justice Department has established the OJP Diagnostic Center as a clearinghouse and resource for jurisdictions not named in the National Initiative, but interested in this kind of approach and work. And not just around reconciliation opportunities and resources, but back to the work on procedural justice and implicit bias. They do assessments, they do training, they have curricula, they can make connections to other parts of the Justice Department. They are actively soliciting outreach on those and related areas, and they can be reached at the web address in front of you. And we've attached to this presentation a couple of things that, excuse me, that go into the previous experience in reconciliation, the drug market work in more detail, and that's the drugs, race, and common ground piece. And then something that the National Network and the COPS office at DOJ put together several years ago, did a DOJ conference on reconciliation that involved community actors and law enforcement from around the country. And it produced what I will say is a very good and helpful think piece and monograph on this, and that is available at the web address, also in front of you. And those documents and a reconciliation brief that the National Initiative has produced are all downloadable along with this PowerPoint presentation through the portal you're using here. So thanks again to DOJ as a whole for building the national initiative and allowing us to work with them on that, to OJJDP for the support and framing for today's webinar, and then a deep bow of thanks to the individual arms within DOJ that donated of their own resources and have been donating their crucially important time and support to make the national initiative work. We are really very grateful for this. There are other such webinars available to you, and this one will be available going forward. And I am going to give it back to our moderators for a little more than 15 minutes of any kind of questions and answering you would like to get into. After I point you to the National Initiative website, which is now in front of you, trustandjustice.org. We are posting all kinds of material and more or less continually updating that. So I hope you all found that useful, and I am at your disposal.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, David. So at this time, we're going to begin the question and answer portion. We'll do our best to answer as many questions in the time allotted. So our first question is, are the process steps of reconciliation presented today generalizable to all reconciliation needs or specific only to police community reconciliation?
I am not going to be bold enough to say that they are, because I am not personally in a position to know whereof I speak on that point. I do not in any way pretend to be a reconciliation expert. If I'm good at anything, it's having a sense about what I think of as the three communities involved in this area that we've been talking about, which is law enforcement, what we normally mean when we say the community, which is the good people in the community, and then that very, very, very small high-risk street population. We have borrowed from really deep national and international expertise to get schooled about reconciliation. And what I will say is that when we had absorbed what they had to teach us and kind of translated it for the particular situation that we're dealing with and said, here are the building blocks, and I think this will work. I'm going to go back to this. That when we said, this is what we think you've taught us, and this is what we think we want to produce, facilitate in the National Initiative sites, they said, yeah, that's it. And I think like a lot of this kind of work, we're dealing with principles, and that what one needs, for example, is safe ways in which both sides can articulate their experience and perceptions and grievances and aspirations to each other. Whether that's a small group meeting between elements on both sides or whether it's a formal hearing process as it was in South Africa, I think all of those details are up for grabs. But I think sort of the essential elements that are represented here and that we've spoken about do come pretty close to being what the fundamental process is about.
Okay, thank you so much. And so our next question is, does the fact-finding element focus on local history, or can it also incorporate national history?
I think that's a really good question. And I don't think we know the answer to it. I think that we will probably get different sensibilities about that even across the the 6 national initiative sites, and I think very reasonable folks in different settings could make different calls on that. And I don't think that there's probably any way to say one's right and the other's not, other than the disposition and desires of people acting locally. The national initiative is built fundamentally around local action in the 6 cities in terms of the intervention and associated research. But that's in a lot of ways an artifact of the way the national initiative was put together. And that does not in any way mean that when local people start talking about what I've called the experience of being policed, that they will limit themselves to that. And we know, first through common sense, but then through the research, that a lot of the experience of being policed is vicarious. And that can be, friends and family and TV in your own city. It can be what you know from your friends and family nationally. It can be what you see on TV. So I think both have all kinds of logic behind them, and I think that it will be very interesting to see how that plays out in practice in this particular work.
Okay, great. And our next question is it possible for communities outside of the national initiative to do this important work?
It absolutely is. And everything you've just seen here is in the public domain. It's been sponsored by the Justice Department, and so by definition it's available nationally. We would make it available nationally anyway. There isn't anything that the national network, or I think this is true for all the other partners, to do that's proprietary unless there are momentary research, human subjects, data sort of issues. So the answer is absolutely yes. And to the extent that we can do that, I know I can speak for the Diagnostic Center and the rest of the Justice Department on this. They will extend all the help that they're capable of to cities that want to do this, and we will as well.
All right. And the next question is, what actions can policymakers take in addressing this issue and fostering reconciliation?
So I think there's a big answer and a small answer to that. And the big answer is the one that we've been grappling with within the national initiative, which is what would a workable, deliberate structure and process look like? And what you've just seen and heard is the best we've got on that right now. I have absolutely no doubt that will change rapidly as we go out into the field, but we think we've got a solid starting point now. And as we've been talking about, the national initiative and other cities can and I think will commit to doing this kind of thing. I think within that, there are initial steps that police departments can take. So I think there's attention on this within the position in which police departments find themselves. So one very well-intentioned instinct on the part of departments is to say, we want to make a bunch of changes and here are the things we're going to do. And all of those, what I'll call policy and practice changes, could be in fact entirely in alignment with what communities want, and putting them all into practice unilaterally does not address the thing one hears from angry communities over and over and over again, which is, you don't listen to us. Once again, you are just going off on your own, doing what you want, and that does not change the relationship between us, and it doesn't indicate that you respect us any more than you ever have. So we don't think that just policy and practice changes are enough, and thus the rest of this reconciliation framework. At the same time, we think that beginning this process by having the department say, here are a couple of things that I'm going to do on my own because they're within my power, and I'm going to do them out of respect and to indicate that I really get it, is also really helpful. And so we think some number of those more or less unilateral actions should be built into the beginning of the process. As I said, we've got a long list of what those sorts of things might look like. That will be available through trustandjustice.org relatively soon, and again, it will all be public. But I like a story out of Greensboro, North Carolina, which found itself on the front page of the New York Times, which had done an analysis saying that there was huge disparity in traffic stops between black residents and white residents in Greensboro. And the chief's response to that was to say, right, I am going to tell my officers not to make a very wide range of discretionary traffic stops. You know, if there are real public safety issues, yes, of course, but if traffic stops are a way in which bias are playing out while we figure out what's going on, we're just not going to do them. And he didn't consult on that, he just made it happen. And so I think there are a number of things, any number of things like that that agencies can do that will help establish their goodwill.
Excellent. And our next question is, how does the process of reconciliation differ from Operation Ceasefire?
Well, they're compatible, but they're quite different. And the main thing that ceasefire is aimed at is explicit real-time violence prevention. And that does not explicitly incorporate much of what you've just heard about. It does not involve a formal look at history. It absolutely addresses relationships, but it doesn't necessarily take them on, literally and explicitly. What we think, and all of the national initiative sites are doing ceasefire or something quite like it that was built into the process. And we think that, in fact, ceasefire can support this process because it becomes a way of saying to communities, we are going to do a better job of helping produce public safety while not treating entire communities as if they're dangerous, and making sure that that small high-risk population that drives the violence gets the benefit of your moral direction, direct contact with you. You can explicate your expectations. We will make sure they're offered help, and we'll make sure that they get prior notice of how law enforcement's going to behave. And we are going to work with you to police your community in ways that are more effective, more respectful, and do less collateral harm. So we think they go together very well.
Okay, great. And I think we have time for one more question. So I'll end with, how can we address the need to have discussions internally within policing agencies to get officers on board before the agency leadership goes public?
I think there are two things to be said about that. So one is that as we do the procedural justice work in the national initiative, overwhelmingly what rank and file and union folks say is perfectly happy to hear that I should treat the community with more respect. When are we going to start treating each other with more respect inside this agency? And it has sparked a real conversation about internal procedural justice in police departments, and we're learning a lot from that as we go along. I think The other thing is this process is simply going to be very hard for everybody in agencies. This is not going to be easy. And I think the main thing that leadership can say to rank and file is, we are not saying that you have done anything wrong. A lot of this is deeply historical, and fundamentally the rest of it is about leadership. And we're going to own this. We're going to drive this. We're going to make sure that you're part of it. But none of this is in any way saying, as leadership often says, we're doing fine, but they need more training, right? That is really an abrogation of responsibility.
Okay, wonderful. So it looks like we've hit the 1 hour mark. Thank you so much, David. I would like to begin closing this webinar by thanking all of you for your time, enthusiasm, and participation. Feel free to further engage with the material provided, or by visiting us at trustandjustice.org, or by following us on Twitter at trustandjustice. Thank you again, and I'll hand it over to Carissa at NTAC for a final closing.
Thank you, Nana. We have just a few reminders. We would appreciate it if everyone could please take 5 minutes to complete the feedback survey. For more information, contact OJADP, NTAC, or John Jay College. Here is the feedback survey link. Thank you again for joining us today, and have a great afternoon.